My name is Judith Farber-Weissman, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you to Leo Baeck Temple, the community of engagement, used to be called elders. We are still elders. Today, we could not have done this, having J Street and Ilan with us, without Laura Maslin's help. Thank you, Laura, so much. Really, really. Please turn off your phones or silence them. And I will turn this over to Nicole, who really makes everything happen, I can tell. Where are you?
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Judy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Molina. I'm the J Street Regional Director for Greater Los Angeles. I really want to thank Leo Baeck Temple and the community of engagement for hosting us. We really appreciate it. And it's my pleasure now. Can you hear me? Okay, great. It's my pleasure to introduce someone who truly embodies thoughtful leadership and a lifelong commitment to community and dialogue. That's Rabbi John Rosoff. Where is he? Oh, there he is. Okay. So Rabbi John Rosoff is Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Israel of Hollywood, where he served as senior rabbi for over 30 years. His resume is far longer than what I can do justice to here, but for the sake of time, I'll just highlight a few of the many ways he's contributed to Jewish life and thought. He's held major leadership roles in the Reform movement and in the pro-Israel, pro-peace community, including serving as national chairman of the Association of Reform Zionists of America, that's ARZA. He served as a member of the International Advisory Council for the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, and as national co-chair of J Street's very own Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet. Rabbi Rosoff is a prolific author with several books exploring Judaism, Israel, and Jewish identity, including Why Judaism Matters, Why Israel and Its Future Matters, and most recently, From the West to the East, a memoir of a liberal American rabbi. Rabbi Rosoff and his wife Barbara live here in Los Angeles. They are the proud parents of two sons, David and Daniel. You'll hear from Daniel later today. He's a J Street leader. And Daniel's married to John's daughter-in-law, Marina, who's here with their two children. Hello, back there. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi John Rosoff. You can use this or that one.
Thank you. It's good to be back home. I grew up here. That's the other thing. I was with several of you. I think I was part of the group that came from San Vicente. How many of you were part of Leo Baeck then? Okay, it's a few. That was before Leonard Bierman and William Charlin came here and established Leo Baeck Temple. Ilan, this is going to be kind of a Rosoff sandwich, because I'm introducing you, and my son Daniel is going to close, who's in the back. And Daniel was really the one who brought me to J Street. He met Jeremy at Len Hill and Patty's home right after he started J Street. And he came home and he said, "Dad, you have to get involved with J Street." I said, "What is that?" Because J Street didn't exist in Washington, D.C., still doesn't, except us. And he drew me in at the very beginning, so I've been very proud to be part of the rabbinic community of J Street, which has not always been easy and continues not to be easy, though we are now, J Street is the mainstream pro-Israel, pro-democracy group in the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. But we can hear more about that later. But my happy role is to introduce our esteemed leader today, whose resume is quite spectacular for his short 47 years of life. Ilan Goldenberg is Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at J Street. He's a seasoned foreign policy and national security expert with 2 decades of experience advising American leaders on the Middle East, U.S.-Israel relations, and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Iran. During the October 7th Hamas attacks and the early months of the war in Gaza, he served as the special advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris on the Middle East, Subsequently, he became the National Director for Jewish Outreach and Policy Advisor on Vice President Harris's 2024 presidential campaign. Ilan previously served at the State Department as part of the small negotiating team supporting Secretary of State John Kerry's initiative to conduct permanent status peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians that never got anywhere because the Prime Minister of Israel was really not interested in it, right? At the Department of Defense, he was the Iran team chief, advising department leaders on all issues pertaining to Iran's nuclear program and regional behavior. A prolific writer and commentator. How many of you have, before today, have watched Ilan on J Street Substacks? Okay, so you know a lot of this already. He's authored 15 reports on U.S. policy in the Middle East when he served as the director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security. His writing has been featured in leading publications, including The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Politico, The Atlantic, and Haaretz. He's also appeared as a commentator on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, CBS, and probably everywhere else as well. He was born in Jerusalem to American parents who made Aliyah after meeting at a Jewish summer camp in the United States, I assume, and then moved to New Jersey at the age of 8. We are meeting a week from Tuesday, on which will be the 30th anniversary since Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated. And we honor his memory as a soldier and as a peacemaker whose killing truly set back his dreams to end the war and bloodshed in the Middle East. Jeremy is currently in Jerusalem as a delegate of the World Zionist Congress, and he wrote this morning a letter. Did any of you read it? It's worth reading if you get the Substacks. I want to quote him very briefly about Prime Minister Rabin. As one of Israel's greatest soldiers, Rabin knew the true strength. That true strength comes not from the trigger finger, but from the outstretched hand. In pursuit of peace, he did something unimaginably difficult. He shook the hand of the man he once fought, not because he trusted him, but because he knew the alternative was endless war. He stood ready to lead Israel on a different path, one defined by courage, pragmatism, and the conviction that our future depends on peace with our neighbors. And then his life was cut short, his dream deferred. Rabin's dream is our charge as 21st century liberal Zionists, Jews who know that Zionism without peace, justice, and democracy cannot endure. Ilan is as fine an expert on this part of the world that we're here to hear about as any of us could hope for. And as we Jews and Israelis continue to exist in a PTSI, a post-traumatic stress injury, not whatever the D stands for, and the Palestinians too, all of us are in need of healing and of a way forward that's optimistic and that hopefully will enable us to see something in our lifetime. So Ilan, it's a pleasure to welcome you to sunny, warm Southern California.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Laura, for setting this up and making this happen, to some of our J Street leaders who are right here in the front row and around the room, and also to our staff, who I think many of you know and will meet: Nicole, Jessica, Casey, I think more, but those are the three I see right now. But maybe what I thought I'd do is speak for a little while, tell you a little bit more about me, although the Rabbi has done quite a good job there, a little bit about J Street and what we're up to, and then spend probably most of the time talking about, okay, like what's happening in the Middle East right now, where are we at this moment, and a little bit about how it bounces back here in the American Jewish community. So first, about me, my parents met at Camp Tel Yehuda, young Judea, when they were 14 years old. made Aliyah. I was born on Mount Scopus, at Mount Scopus Hadassah, so I always say like right on the green line, right at the heart of the conflict. And that really is what inspired me after I moved to the United States to stay engaged and really pursue this as a career, making peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I always talk about this, so it was interesting, again, that Jeremy wrote about it today and brought it up, but I was 17 years old writing my college application essays about making peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It's what my daughter is doing right now this fall when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated just 30 years ago at this point, right around this time of year. And I don't think any of us realized at the time what that would mean and how with him would go the best opportunity for peace really in a generation. Fast forward about 15 years, continued to pursue that pathway and that career, and ended up volunteering on Barack Obama's campaign in 2007 and 2008. And then when he won, went into the Pentagon and worked on Iran issues for a few years. Really, the Pentagon is the Department of What If Everything Goes Wrong. It's one of the main parts of what you do there. So in the case of Iran, that meant planning for war, trying to prevent war by thinking about alternatives, also planning for the possibility of an Israeli strike on Iran, and if that triggered a U.S.-Israel, a U.S.-Iran war. So happy to talk more about that in Q&A also in terms of where we are on that issue. But obviously in the last few months, that's been a big thing. And from there, negotiating between Israelis and Palestinians at the State Department for a couple years. And after a few years off and doing other things, especially when we had a different administration in power, found myself working for Kamala Harris as her Middle East advisor on October 7th. And in the months after, that was the hardest thing I ever had to do professionally. Just really, really hard time just dealing with all of it. And really from the beginning, the role that I took in that job was planning for the day after. So a lot of what we are seeing right now, a lot of the ideas that we are seeing now are things that we started talking about at the White House in late October, early November of 2023. And from the beginning, our whole theory of the case was, you have to do this now. You have to plan for what happens in the aftermath of the war, because the aftermath of the war starts the second the war is still going on. We've learned that from places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, that if you're not building an alternative to whatever it is you're fighting, if you're just going in and shooting, then all you're going to be doing is essentially playing whack-a-mole unless you're building a security and governance alternative. We took these ideas to the Israeli government in the fall of 2023. I had colleagues at the Ministry of Defense, at the Shin Bet, which is the intelligence agency responsible for doing a lot of work with the Palestinians, who wanted to work with us on this. But the message came back, we can't because our leadership will not let us work with you on this. Because any plan that involves replacing Hamas in Gaza involves Palestinian leadership and some kind of legitimate and effective security and governance mechanism in Gaza. And Netanyahu did not want to do that, especially because he had people in his coalition, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and other extremists, who did not buy into the idea of Palestinians controlling Gaza in the aftermath of the war. And for him to start doing that kind of work and that kind of planning would have meant potentially collapsing his own government and coalition. And so here we are 2 years later, and a lot of the same ideas are still on the table, and we'll talk about them. And it's good that they're on the table, and it's frankly good that they're part of this 20-point peace plan Donald Trump has put together. Kind of blows my mind to say that, but it's true, right? I'm very supportive of what they're doing right now at the moment on this issue. Lots of other things we have a lot of concerns and disagreements about. But they could be so much further along if they had been working with us for the past 2 years, and if the Israeli leadership had been willing to let us do that work over the past 2 years. And frankly, it wasn't just the MOD and the Shabak. It was also people like Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot and Yoav Gallant, who were all part of that war cabinet for the first year of the war, who ultimately left the war cabinet with their disagreements over Netanyahu because there was a refusal to plan for this day after. So that was my experience working at the White House, by the summer, I was incredibly frustrated and exhausted with where, to some extent, where our policy was, very much more so frustrated with where the Netanyahu government was taking things, was ready to leave government and go do other things, and then suddenly Kamala Harris became the nominee. And I got an interesting phone call, and it was basically, we need somebody to talk to the American Jewish community who knows where she really is on these issues when it comes to Israel and Gaza and the war. We'd like you to go do that. And so I ended up running national Jewish outreach on a presidential campaign. Not something I had ever done or expected to do in my life. Politics as opposed to policy, very different world. Really eye-opening. And what I took out of that experience, really two things. The first was, you could spend all these months looking at what's happening in the Middle East and happening in Gaza and Israel, but I hadn't really understood what was happening inside the American Jewish community. I was too absorbed with that at the White House. And now I felt it every day talking to people about that PTSI, if you want to call it that people here were feeling, and how hard that was. The other thing I really took out of that experience was an understanding that on October 7th and the days after October 7th, we had this huge polarization in the American Jewish community, in the Democratic Party in particular. We had some folks who went hard right. We're going to support Prime Minister Netanyahu and whatever he wants to do no matter what. Others who went left or were just in the world of protesting against Israel on October 8th, right? But the overwhelming majority of American Jews I talked to, the overwhelming majority of Democratic voters I talked to were neither of these two camps. They wanted Israel to thrive as a secure, democratic Jewish state. And they believed Palestinians deserve their rights to freedom and security in a state of their own. They understood that October 7th was a horrific attack committed by a terrorist organization that's responsible for a lot of the suffering in Gaza. And they were horrified by the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, much of which was also brought on by Israeli government policies. And they recognized that there was terrible growing anti-Semitism in the United States, coming both from the right and from the left. And at the same time, were deeply concerned and did not want very legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism to be weaponized and used for things like going after universities, defunding education, going after free speech, and associating criticism, even sharp but legitimate criticism of the Israeli government, with anti-Semitism. And so after the campaign was over, I took some time to breathe and think and sleep and teach my daughter how to drive. This is maybe the proudest thing from those 4 or 5 months, also the most challenging, of taking a break. I really decided I wanted to elevate that voice, those voices that are not as loud sometimes, but really are where the majority of American Jews are. And that's why I came to J Street. Because I looked around and I realized this is the best platform to do that. And so that's what I've been doing. And what we do, J Street, ultimately, we are an American political organization. That is our focus. Our focus is on the debate on the issues of Israel here in the United States. We like to say we are pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy. So that is the kind of conversation we are trying to drive here, a conversation that is nuanced and thoughtful and can express love for Israel and support for Israel, but also real disagreements with the Israeli government and a recognition that for Israel to thrive, Palestinians also need to thrive. And we do that in a number of different ways. You can talk to folks, you can talk to our team here, you can talk to our leaders here in Los Angeles, but it's everything from we lobby members of Congress on particular pieces of legislation. We engage and raise funds through our political action committee, through our PAC, which supports various candidates who view the world the way we do and support our positions. We take members of Congress and leaders and others to Israel and Palestine and have them see both sides of the conflict. Too many of those trips only have people going to Israel and not really engaging with Palestinians. We make sure that they get equal time in both. You see, I've been on a number of these delegations. You go to the communities that were savaged on October 7th, and you go into the West Bank, and you go to places in Hebron and the Hebron Hills, for example, who are suffering from settler violence on a regular basis. You really see the full picture. Is another central thing we do. We also have chapters all over the country, and one of the things we do is what we're doing here right now, bringing American Jews together for conversations exactly like this one. And we have more than 45 chapters at universities, J Street U chapters, which I think are one of the most interesting and important things we do, because this whole polarization that's happened in the American Jewish community and the American debate has been more extreme on campus than anywhere else. And our students, they really, I like to say, they're not out there waving an Israeli flag and they're not out there waving a Palestinian flag, right? They are actually having these hard conversations and holding this place in the middle on-campus conversations where they can talk to everybody. And so these are all things that we're doing as J Street. And what we're trying to also do, really aim for the 50-yard line of the Jewish community and the Democratic Party on these issues, especially the Jewish community here in the United States. But as a movement, we're inclusive. So it's really, I always talk about it, the 30-yard line on one side to the 30-yard line on the other. We have members who have very different views and disagreements on different issues. Like, to give you one very hot topic in the news these days, we have members in our New York chapter who are very supportive of Mamdani. We have members in our New York chapter who really don't like him and have major concerns about him. That's okay. This is part of what we're trying to do in building the majority of American Jews and building this movement. And that increasingly, I think, as Rabbi said, is very reflective of the dominant position of the Democratic Party and American Jews in this country. So what is happening right now in terms of where things go? Should start by just saying, after 2 years of just pushing as hard as we can, to end the war and get the hostages out and get aid into Gaza, just very thankful we are at this moment, finally. And it's delicate. The ceasefire is going to remain delicate for a while. I am very happy that Donald Trump, who I never expected to do this and was very frustrated by for such a long time on these issues, on so many other things, as we said, where I disagree with him. At the end of the day, the administration made the right decision. I think what happened was we had this strike on Doha about a month ago by the Israeli government. It was almost like they went a step too far. All the Arab states came to the United States, because I think it was not just the Qataris, but also the Saudis, the Emiratis, others. Nobody wanted to see a strike in the middle of the day on an pretty close American partner with a major American military base, just in the middle of downtown Doha. It was just too much for a lot of the Arab states. Came to the president and his team, said, enough is enough. For those of you who are J Street leaders, who were in DC about a month ago, we were just talking about how shocking this was at the gathering we had in Washington. And I think it finally got the Trump administration to flip and apply a lot of pressure both on Netanyahu and also on Qatar and Egypt and the mediators to apply pressure on Hamas to come to a deal to end the war. And it's a really good thing. Now, the real question is, where does this go from here? And I see two pathways. I see the more likely pathway, and it's not the positive pathway, but it's the one we need to recognize. And that is the pathway that has happened in every other single war we've had in Gaza previously, which is the parties agreed. They always have this agreement. There's a whole bunch of things associated with it that starts with the fighting stops, and then all the other things never happen. And there's a world where that happens, where basically what we end up with is Israel is going to control half of Gaza, Hamas is going to control half of Gaza, you're going to have some humanitarian aid get in, but nothing's really going to fundamentally change. That's a world, you could call that almost like Mogadishu on the Mediterranean. It's just going to be a terrible situation. Or if you want to put it in Israeli-Palestinian context, similar to Jenin on steroids, if anybody is familiar with the refugee camps in the West Bank, that where Israel just kind of goes in when it needs to, but it's just a really terrible situation. It's also a world where, for Israel, in terms of how it is viewed internationally and where it stands, will be what Prime Minister Netanyahu would call super Sparta, which is something he said in a speech a few weeks ago. Increasingly isolated, the world not seeing things the same way, and having its economic relationships with Europe cut off, moving towards, frankly, a pariah state, which is what we've seen over the last 2 years, sadly. Not something any of us want to see. And it's not good for American Jews, by the way, either, obviously. That's a very bad scenario for American Jews. Or there's an alternative. And this is where I'm hopeful. Because the alternative is out there, and it's spelled out in the 20-point plan. And most of those ideas, again, they're things I was working on almost 2 years ago. And you've seen it continue. And that's not to take any credit. That's actually to say these are ideas that have been developed over a period of time. And what those ideas include is, again, starts with how do you replace Hamas with something different? Everybody's talking about disarming Hamas right now, right? Disarming Hamas, you're not going to go in there and disarm Hamas tomorrow. That's not how this works. You have to replace Hamas. This is what you have to do. And this is what we've done successfully, for example, in the counter-ISIS campaign. So how does that happen? First you have an alternative security mechanism on the ground. Somebody who can go in and say, we are the arbiters of basic police and security in Gaza, and we can demonstrate to the local population that we have credibility and can keep them safe. That starts with what you eventually want is Palestinian security forces in there who are doing that policing. It's going to take time to build them up, although they're already being trained in Egypt and Jordan. There's a history of the U.S. training Palestinian security forces, including in the West Bank. In going back to 2007, we started doing that in a significant way. It's one of the few positive stories in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last 15, 20 years that's actually worked. And so you start with actually an international Arab force that comes in temporarily, holds things on the ground, supports these Palestinians as they are building up their forces, and over time, Palestinians take over, provide that security, and start to replace Hamas. Why does Hamas agree to that or let that happen? Because there's the other thing. This international force is not going to come in and fight Hamas directly. Hamas agrees to it because they're in a very weak position, and they think that they can weather the storm. They think that we could allow this to happen, and we'll still actually keep all of our guns, and we'll be fine, and we'll be powerful, like Hezbollah was in Lebanon. But in this scenario, you actually need to have these forces, when Hamas is so weak, actually provide a security at a higher level. And also Hamas is not able to rearm itself because there's no way to get weapons into Gaza. It's not like Lebanon where Iran can just fly weapons in. And over time, you marginalize and weaken them. And this is a history of how this works in counterinsurgency, and it's worked in other cases. At the same time, you build up alternative governance. Again, this is also spelled out in the 20-point plan. And the alternative governance involves originally some kind of Palestinian technocratic government that includes, that all the key Palestinian factions are going to have to agree. It cannot have any Hamas members in it. Hamas is going to have to agree to let these people come in. So you're probably going to have all these negotiations going on in Cairo with the Egyptians essentially banging heads and trying to bring these different Palestinian factions together. Over time, you have part of that is a Palestinian Authority. You have this entity empowered, and you eventually have elections. You try to bring back the Palestinian Authority to both Gaza and the West Bank. If all this sounds incredibly hard and incredibly complicated, it's because it is. And it's going to be very messy, and it would have been much better if it had started 2 years ago, and it didn't because this Israeli government refused to do it, and that's going to make it harder now. But you've also had previous examples where it's actually worked in places like Iraq and places like Syria, and it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be a total mess, and it's going to involve trial and error, and it's going to be pretty ugly. But why do I think, and by the way, still, the higher likelihood is the first scenario, let's be honest, but this is a scenario we have to fight for and advocate for and push for. Why do I think maybe now is a moment where it could work? Well, if you look at the history of this conflict, these horrible moments are the moments that sometimes actually shift the conflict in a better direction. The example I always go back to is the Yom Kippur War, right? In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli public was traumatized. Their basic concept of security was fundamentally threatened, even though at the end of the day they won the war. You now have similarly an Israeli, and what happened 5 years after that horrible war? You ended up with peace between Israel and Egypt, right? Why? One, Israelis realized they needed a different approach. I think that Israeli public is only now starting to wrestle with, like, what does the future hold? And the future could be, we want to double down on the world of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and just kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza. Or it could be some kind of a new approach. But what it cannot be is, let's go back to how things were before October 7th. Let's just manage the conflict. That's where we were for the past 20 years. Israeli public has realized that that's not going to work, right? On top of that, you've also got other very promising things. Again, after 1973, the U.S., which had kind of been treating this conflict as a little bit of a sideshow, it caused a global oil crisis. It caused almost nuclear escalation between the U.S. and the USSR. And so in the aftermath, starting with Henry Kissinger and then eventually Jimmy Carter dove really deep into this conflict, you can see that same scenario playing out right now with the U.S. I mean, frankly, the administration I was serving in, the basic view before October 7th was, this is becoming increasingly a sideshow. What matters is Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Palestinian issue is not as important. That's not the case anymore, right? The U.S. is super focused on this now, and also the Arab states are all super focused on this now. And on top of that, you have an Israel that, from a security perspective, having really rolled back Hezbollah, having rolled back Iran pretty dramatically over the past couple years, is in a stronger position to make a kind of a deal. So there's a world now where what you can see happening over the next few years is start with Gaza, bring the international community in, bring the Arabs in, build up this force, build up this governance. Israel and the Arab states start working on this all together. And at the same time, you also start moving that towards what you would call, what J Street would call the 23-state solution. Peace between Israel and all the Arab states, and the creation of a new Arab state, Palestine, as the 23rd state. Because what the Arab states are also saying now, which they weren't necessarily fully saying before October 7th, is we got to solve this Palestinian issue, and we're not going to ultimately have relations between Israel and the Arab states unless we also have freedom for the Palestinians. So there is this moment of potential opportunity if we can push on it. Now, that requires a couple of things. First of all, it requires a new Israeli government. It's not going to happen with this Israeli government, a government that is still very aggressively, and I haven't even mentioned, pursuing settlements in the West Bank, supporting settler violence in the West Bank, and is going to stand in the way, really did this deal kicking and screaming, and is going to stand in the way of any real progress. Most importantly, this notion of having Palestinians govern and secure Gaza is something that's completely anathema to Netanyahu and his coalition. So we have elections in Israel next year. I think that the pathway here is going to have to be make as much progress as you can until then, but elections in Israel will happen probably sometime between June and November, if you had to ask me. Polling is pretty good, but still uneven. But if you get a different Israeli government, it's not going to necessarily be a full left-leaning Israeli government that wants to do exactly what J Street wants it to do. But it'll still be much better than Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir. And it'll be kind of a center, right, left coalition. Then you can start making progress, especially if you have a geopolitical lineup that is, the way I'm describing it, much better and more promising for these types of things than we had previously. It's also going to require, I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in the Trump administration to pull this off. Let's be honest. I mean, you can criticize him for a lot of things. The fascination with the Nobel Peace Prize being a big reason why he pushed on this. There's still some real questions about financial double dealing, which is why there's a lot of motivation for strong relationships with the Gulf states. And there's always the danger he just loses interest, right? I mean, frankly, we could have had this deal in March if he had just paid attention and decided to do it instead of for 6 months giving Netanyahu a green light to do whatever he wanted. We could have had this peace deal that was negotiated at the very end, the ceasefire that was negotiated at the very end of the Biden administration to early Trump administration together just continue. So I don't necessarily have a ton of faith in this administration to do any of this. But still, we have this moment of opportunity. we should push on it, we should take it, we should advocate for it. And we should see if we can move as much as possible in that direction, and I do see a pathway. So just maybe to close, what does this all mean for the American Jewish community? I think it means a lot. It's been a very hard couple years to be a liberal American Jew, which is what, more than 70% of American Jews in this country are, right? You've got a American government now who you don't really trust, and in many cases is using very real concerns about anti-Semitism to do all kinds of things that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. You've got an Israeli government who 70% of American Jews oppose, and who 75% of Israelis were opposed to their policies up until they decided to finally prioritize getting the hostages out. It's been challenging with progressives too in the aftermath of October 7th, and we have to acknowledge that too. A lot of places where American Jews are used to going for allyship were not necessarily there in the same way that we would have expected, and also arise very much of, some pretty strong anti-Zionist currents in the progressive movement. I think important to distinguish between very harsh criticism of Israel that trends into anti-Zionism and BDS, and are things that we don't support at J Street. We're very clear about that. And at the same time, anti-Semitism, which sometimes those things are linked, and at other times they're not. And then also it's been really challenging because you've had a lot of the most powerful organized American Jewish groups choose to kind of go along with the Netanyahu government's approach to things, or not really stand up against it, and also not necessarily stand up loudly enough against what we've been seeing with the Trump administration and the times when they're, again, using anti-Semitism for other purposes. And so all that makes it really, really hard to be an American Jew right now. But it feels to me, with the war ending, if we can make real progress on all these issues, not only would that be a great thing for Israelis and a great thing for Palestinians, but it would also just take a lot of the heat that we've all been feeling so much here out of this issue, and maybe make it just easier to be an American Jew again on a daily basis. Where going into 26 and 28, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a major political issue that people are fighting about every day. These would be good things, and if it was happening because positive things were happening on the ground. So at J Street, we're going to continue to advocate for progress, and we're going to continue to push for our political leaders to support the positive developments we've seen, and continue to push on all the things I've been describing. And hopefully this is the beginning of something better than the last couple of years. And I'll stop there.
Was I wrong? No, it's not. I'm going to ask two quick questions, and then we'll open it up for anybody else who would like to ask. With regards to young American Jews, liberal American Jews under the age of, say, 40, 45, I have seen, as I'm sure you have, as probably everybody in the room has, that there is great discomfort with Israel right now. I gave a sermon on Kol Nidre at my synagogue and made some leaps that resonated with young liberal American Jews who were before I spoke turning away, thinking that the American liberal institutional community, synagogues, national organizations, camps, and so forth, just really hadn't addressed. So my question to you is, and I know J Street U is extraordinary, 45 campuses, something like that around the country, that's really doing, these are the cream of the crop of our young people, always has been. But the under 40 crowd, there's another group there that really needs some TLC from J Street, because there's really no other than NIF and a few of the liberal organizations, there's really no political organization in the United States that I see on the scene that can do what J Street can do. So that group between J Street U and 40, 45-year-olds, that's my first question. What is J Street trying to do there? And the second one is in the Middle East. About 25 years ago, I met Marwan Barghouti in Ramallah in his offices. And there was a group of about 15, 20 rabbis and me. I was asked to be the interlocutor with him. As a little guy, none of us knew who he was at the time. He was the head of Fatah in the West Bank. And one of the questions I asked him was, are you, he was Yasser Arafat's right-hand man, and he's been in jail since 2002 for the responsibility of at least 4 Israeli deaths. He didn't pull the trigger, but his organization, Tanzim, was responsible. But here, Israel released 2,000 people, many of whom have blood on their hands. But they didn't release Marwan Barghouti, who is really the only Palestinian leader who could galvanize the Palestinian people into one unit to be able to negotiate with the state of Israel. So clearly he's not going to be released by Bibi, but do you see the possibility down the road of him being released and Israel working with him? And do you know what he's thinking? To us, he said there were only 2 issues that he thought that the Palestinians were concerned about, that they would need to negotiate. He was for a 2-state solution. Jerusalem and the refugees' right to return to their own homes and villages. So the first thing about young American liberal Jews, second about Marwan Barghouti. Vakasha.
Easy questions. So on liberal Jews. So first of all, absolutely, there's a real generational difference that exists between, people. I always say Joe Biden, right, who I worked for, who saw Israel as, always started talking about Israel about the first time he met Golda Meir, right? And really grew up with the Israel underdog, post-Holocaust miracle, versus what I would say is my generation, which is the Oslo generation, of growing up with Israel strong, thriving, but still trying to do better, versus, my kids' generation are not the 40-somethings, they're like the 20, or even younger, but the people who, I think if you're under the age of 30, what do you really remember about Israel and you're an American Jew, is Bibi Netanyahu and just this Israel. So the most important thing that has to change, and that J Street can't change, is a different Israeli leadership. We can help our allies. We do engage regularly with various civil society organizations in Israel and things like that. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily our mission. Our mission is a debate here. So that's a big piece. The other of it is to engage this next generation when they come out of J Street U in other kinds of ways. Part of it is there are people who are there. It's a little harder and more challenging because, people who are at their busiest times in life, I'll speak as one myself, right, is when you have kids, especially young kids, and you're probably doing less of the kinds of things. It's why rooms like this often have more folks whose kids are out of high school than below. So you have to find new ways of engaging. But we find, for us, it's always super important as we're building chapters to find that age demographic. And really, you only need a few, and then they bring in their friends and others. But it's the same basic content, and it's the same basic kind of work, but it's still something that we're working on. In terms of Barghouti, yeah, he's one example of, and maybe the best example of somebody who can really bring a unified Palestinian alternative. And why is he not being released, right? It goes to this Israeli government and the strategy that they've pursued going back to 2009 for sure. Right, what we had is, the first Intifada, similar if you go back and look at the history of this, right? The Yom Kippur War actually got us Camp David Accords afterwards. The first Intifada triggered a rethinking in Israeli society that ultimately got us the Oslo process, a recognition they had to deal with Palestinians. The second intifada convinced the Israeli public that there was no partner, and the strategy for the past 20 years, up until October 7th, was manage the conflict. And part of what managed the conflict meant under Netanyahu was, let's make sure there can never be a deal by keeping Palestinians divided. So let's allow, and this actually happened, millions and more than $1 billion in cash land at Ben Gurion Airport from Qatar, be put on trucks and driven into Gaza and given to Hamas. You know, that is crazy. And that's what happened under this government at the same time that it systematically was cutting funds off from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Now, the Palestinian Authority has all kinds of challenges in terms of corruption and poor governance, and a lot of reform needs to happen there too. No question about it. But imagine if Israel for the past 20 years had pursued a strategy of trying to empower Palestinian moderates and weaken extremists instead of doing the exact opposite. I don't think we would have had October 7th, and I think we'd have a much better chance of peace. So that doesn't mean we have to put a lot of responsibility on poor Palestinian leadership, but not just poor Palestinian leadership. And Barghouti represents exactly this. He represents a potential for better Palestinian leadership, and that's why Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir absolutely do not want him out of prison because of that precise possibility. But in the aftermath of October 7th, and now that the war is over, and Israeli society really has been, since October 7th, they've just been waiting for the hostages to come home. We did an event the day the hostages, the day the deal was announced, and we had a couple of hostage family members on this call that we did with J Street, and one of them said, every day since October 7th, 2023 has been October 7th, 2023. Today is October 9th, 2025. And that to me was like, okay, like now that this first step is done, Israeli society is really going to start wrestling and debating this. And I think one of the things they're really going to have to debate is, how did we let this happen? Maybe we just need to think of a whole different approach here. So I think we can open it up for questions. We'll start with her.
Yes, and I can bring
You're
you.
gonna-
I can
yeah.
bring you. Oh, there we go. You're good? Okay.
I think there's a live stream issue, but you can speak, and then I'll summarize the question briefly so that live streamers can also hear it. We'll do that.
I'm David Bubis, JC co-chair for LA. I was asked to move this closer to So this morning, interestingly, there was a column in Times of Israel that your colleague Nadav Tamir wrote, our director in Israel, and he pointed out that aside from Yair Golan, who's the head of the Democrat Party,
Yes.
no Israeli leader of any party would be interested in forming a government with the Arab political parties, which represent 20% of the population. I know this isn't your bailiwick per se.
It's part of what yes, for sure, yeah.
Given what you just stated, which is now that Israel's just starting to go over its trauma 2 years ago, do you think there might be more of an openness to that, opening that door, and really establishing more of a center-left government as opposed to center-right?
Sure. And so the question, anybody watching, I think, on live stream is Arab Israelis, and can they be brought into any kind of political coalition with the left-wing government? I think it's vital that start to happen. I mean, in this country, what if centrist Democrats were to say, our 30 most left-leaning progressives, people like AOC and Bernie Sanders, they're not part of our coalition anymore. Like, we can't work with them. It's just politically, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's incredibly damaging for the purposes of trying to have a center to center-left government. Is there more potential to do it? I think there is. And part of the reason there is because you had this other government a couple of years ago before the Netanyahu government, which had for the first time an Arab party fully in it. I think Netanyahu and the extreme right have so mobilized people that there's a recognition that we need an alternative to that. Now, in the days leading up to an election, I think especially from center and center-right parties, from the worlds of, Naftali Bennett or Avigdor Lieberman, you're not going to hear, we're going to work with Arab parties. But if the seats come down to a situation where it's a hung government, a hung parliament, a Netanyahu government, or the center and even some of the center-right, what I would call the never Netanyahus kind of parties, right? They're still better than the alternative, but they're not really as aligned with us. I would see more willingness and space to work on that, but it's also something, there are specific organizations in Israel who are doing political organizing and work on trying to build these ties between the Arab parties and the Jewish left-wing parties. And that is just super crucial, vital work, because without that, there's just no pathway back in Israeli politics for support for a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, a 23-state solution. And even during the Oslo years with Rabin, the Arabs were not in the coalition, but they were supportive from the outside and were playing a key buttressing role of keeping the Rabin government around and voting for all the hardest things and the hardest steps that he was taking to make peace. So maybe this will be one of the big things that, as you're saying, can shift in the aftermath as people start to think harder about what comes next.
Hi. You went over the attack on Qatar, and clearly that was a catalyst, a spark, but there had to be an enormous amount going on below the surface. And it's been very interesting, initially very disappointing after October 7th to see what was being stated in the Arab countries, and then, fantastic to see a shift recently. But to make the 20-point plan work, to your points, more of a shift has to happen. I mean, they have to actually do more than voice. They have to dedicate security forces, and they have to get involved. Can you talk a little bit about what you see happening under the surface? Who are the leaders, and how do you see potentially this happening?
Sure. So actually, and you had the microphone, so I don't have to repeat anything. So yes, so the most important player in this security situation to start with is Egypt and Sisi, because Egypt actually knows Gaza better than anybody else and has ties into Gaza and Hamas better than anybody else because it's Egypt's border, and Egypt is the most invested from a security perspective. Now, the good news was, look, I sat in meetings with Sisi in late 2023 with the vice president, where he started suggesting to us this idea of an international Arab-led force. There's a willingness by these countries to do it, I believe. A willingness that didn't exist before the war, because now there's a recognition of how bad things have gotten and how it's impacting all of them, right? It wasn't, the war started, everything from a fight with Hezbollah to a war between Israel and Iran to the Houthis launching missiles to the Red Sea to bombs going off in Doha. All of that came out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so that's really shifted their mentality. But are they going to do it? Are they going to back up their words with real action? Remains to be seen. They insist on a couple of things. First of all, they want a pathway to a Palestinian state. And the reason they want that is because they want to see a plan. What they say is, and now we move away from Egypt into the Gulf states, who are going to be asked to put billions of dollars into this, right? And what they say is, I need to know that I'm not going to invest all this money and just have it all blown up again in another war 10 years from now or 5 years from now. And so I need to see a pathway towards a Palestinian state. I need to see you all pushing the Israelis in that direction, or I'm not going to do this. And for the Egyptians, and also for some of the others, the Indonesians and the Turks have talked about putting forces in, they also want the U.S. to have some kind of a significant role. We don't have to have American troops in Gaza, but part of the reason you have an American-led coordination mechanism that's already on the ground, which has a couple hundred troops in southern Israel, is because what they were telling us all along is, we need to know you all are fully invested for two reasons. One, if you're fully invested, it means we as the Arab states are getting something politically out of this. We're not doing this for the Israelis. We're doing this, or even for the Palestinians. Part of the reason we're doing this is to curry favor with Washington, because our future, especially for a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Qatar, whose number one objective, above all other, is how do I take all this oil money, which is finite, and convert it into a functioning, effective future for my society economically, investing in things like AI, environment, green, technologies and all these things, is a relationship with the United States that allows access to the American economy for me to do that, and allows access to American technology. So I need to know you guys are in fully. And the other reason they really want us in is because they're also, frankly, at a more practical level, if I'm putting my soldiers into Gaza, I need to know that there's not going to be some tension between Israel and Hamas, and Israel will fire some rockets at something and accidentally kill 10 of my people. That would be a political disaster for me. And that's much less likely to happen if I know that the U.S. is right there with me, and if the Israelis know that by firing on my people, they're going to just absolutely infuriate the U.S. So all of these things are going into it. So I do believe there's, you had this summer, even before the peace deal, you had that was called the New York Declaration, which is France and Saudi Arabia led this effort with a whole bunch of Arab countries and other key players like Pakistan and Indonesia to reaffirm a lot of the things that are now in the 20-point plan, including details on how you do security on the ground, which I will say again, out of all the things, security on the ground inside Gaza is the hardest and the most important. If you can make that work, a lot of this other stuff can happen. And so those are the factors that are going into it, but it's going to be very, very hard, and it's also going to be a lot harder than it would have been if we'd started planning this a year ago, because already you've got, Hamas retaking control. We've seen the stories, right? And if we'd been in a better position, you could have prevented more of that from happening. But I think we had one over here next, and then I'm going to go over there and then come back.
Okay, so I have, in honor of the rabbi, I have two totally unrelated questions. But the first one is, bearing in mind that there's been a significant shift between, really since the election in terms of the Democratic Party's position, or at least individual Democrats' position, but the worry is, I think, that things could go too far into a very negative Israel posture. How do you seize the opportunity where there is increasing criticism of Israel within elected Democratic Party members, while at the same time not allowing that to go too far into sort of a negative existence of Israel position? And then the second question I have is, in the context of Israel's position in the world, how does Israel become a full member of the world nations again without some kind of truth and reconciliation process that recognizes what has happened in Gaza?
Sure. So on the first question, this is exactly what J Street is trying to do, is thread that very important needle, which is, everybody pays attention when J Street, we got to kind of push on both directions, right? We very much disagree with the Netanyahu government, and we've disagreed with the approach, I think, long taken by organizations like AIPAC, that you support Israel by supporting the Israeli government no matter what. So at the same time, when Marjorie Taylor Greene puts forward a piece of legislation to cut off defensive weaponry to Israel, Iron Dome, for example, we advocate very strongly with members of Congress against that legislation. That happened a few months ago. Only 3 members of Congress signed on, and we are able to call up many of the most progressive members of Congress inside the Democratic Party who are not fully aligned with us, right, or to our left. But we can tell them, this is a bad idea, do not support this, and that's kind of how we hold that middle place that we're trying to hold. We also, when Benjamin Netanyahu came to address Congress about, a little over a year ago now, we held an event that's the day before, or maybe it was even the same day, where we had hostage families there to meet with members of Congress. We had over 100 members of Congress there. Many of those members did not want to go or did not go to see Netanyahu speak because they didn't want to be seen with him and wanted to oppose his policies, but they wanted to find a way to express support for Israel, and that's what we were able to do, is create a venue for them to do that. Very, very important. And so we're going to continue to do that. It's a very complicated place we're trying to hold, and the answer is, look, what we're not going back to is pre-October 7th. We're not going back to October 6th. You know, blank checks for Israel for whatever is just not where the Democratic Party is anymore, and we're not going back there. But also, we got to hold on to support for Israel, and this is how we do it. So, support something that limits offensive weapons to Israel or that limits the use of American weapons in Gaza. Good. Oppose anything that starts to cut off ballistic missile defense, for example, and things like that. And we're going to continue to hold that line. Second question was, Israel and the community of nations. Yeah, Israel's got a lot of work to do in terms of how it is perceived internationally now. And I think already just the ceasefire is a positive step in the right direction. I mean, there were things that were starting to happen that would have, I think, made a massive difference, talking about, kicking Israel out of the European Soccer Federation or Eurovision. Eurovision in Israel is huge, I can tell you, as somebody who would live there till I was 8 years old and would spend a lot of Shabbats when there was nothing else on TV back then, watching reruns of Eurovision every day as a 4-year-old. It's like a big cultural thing, and there's been talk of 6 European countries came out and said, we will not participate in Eurovision next year if Israel's in it. My hope is some of that starts to change now at the end of the war. But yeah, it's going to take, the only way to the other side of it is through it. There's a lot of people who I think, including I imagine many kind of traditional organized Jewish community, there's been a lot of pieces written since the war ended. Maybe everything could just go back to how it was. And actually, Jeremy Ben-Ami wrote a good column, just last Sunday. It was basically, that's not happening, guys, unless we have real meaningful progress towards Palestinian rights. And so I think that's how we get there. I think we had.
Yes, my name's Peter Braun. Thank you for being with us. When I first went to Israel, there were 25 Israelis in Hebron. I think you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
There are now over 600,000. And while I recognize that we need to be focusing on Gaza for all the reasons you've laid out, I know and we know that this Netanyahu government has quietly and not so quietly done horrific things and supported the settlers to do even more horrific things. So my question is, while we focus on Gaza as we must, how do we at the same time work towards Israel and Palestine when in fact that land is being cut into pieces? And I, as someone who's been part of J Street for over a dozen years, I worry. I worry fundamentally because strategically, that Israeli government is doing everything they can to, if not de facto annexation, de jure annexation.
For sure, and thank you for that question, because it's really important that we also focus on the West Bank, and it's almost like we've gone back, if you've been following this for a while. Before October 7th, the challenge was everybody is focused on the West Bank and nobody ever paid any attention to Gaza. Now we've got the reverse problem. And so look, a few things that J Street is doing. Most important is we're supporting the West Bank Violence Prevention Act, which is a piece of legislation that would put in place the sanctions that I helped work and write when I was in the Biden administration on violent extremist settlers in the West Bank. Because we have what's happening in the West Bank. I was there, I've been there a couple times over the past few months, and the level of just illegal outposts that are now popping up at a rate that just is shocking. And it's because of this government, and it's because some changes have been made, and now Smotrich is responsible for so much. But what happens is you have these little kind of caravans that post up, and miraculously, within a few days, they're connected to the electricity system, they're connected to the water system, and a big fence gets built around that takes a huge chunk of land with it. Says this is now the farming land associated with these, and it's very systematic effort to displace Palestinians, to take away their land, to take all this territory. The sanctions were, I think, quite actually effective at the end of the Biden administration and starting to send a signal, because some of them were targeted at individuals, but the really important ones were targeted at organizations funding this violence. And it's not just the violence, the organizations that fund the violence also fund the settlements, and you start getting at the money, and that's, I think, a pretty significant step. None of that still is going to, two things I will say. You still need a different Israeli government. Again, you need to get rid of some of these extremists. And again, I don't know what this new Israeli government looked like that's an alternative, but if you have people like Yair Golan and Yair Lapid in positions of power instead of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, that would make a big difference, even if they're not running the country. But we can also have to acknowledge that a lot of the settlement growth has happened under labor governments and has happened under left-wing governments. So the politics of this really need to change. The other is, I have increasingly become convinced that, those who say, well, now it's just physically impossible because you can't disentangle the people. I think there are still creative solutions for that. I don't think 80% of the settlers can be drawn into an Israeli map pretty quickly. But I'm increasingly, and this is not an official J Street position, this is now Ilan Goldenberg still thinking it through. And I'm not sure where I am exactly, but you're still talking about a couple 100,000 people outside of that territory now. I don't think you realistically can politically in Israel move them. I do think what the Israelis have shown over the past few years is if you spend a lot of money building roads and systems that are just for settlers, you can connect all kinds of interesting things together in weird kind of horrible ways. But if you had a deal that actually brought about a Palestinian state, and you had the Saudis and the international community and others investing that kind of money in Palestinian roads too, you could build a system that actually has parallel functionality for both. So I think there are all kinds of different creative solutions you're going to have to figure out for what to do with this. I'm not ready to give up on precisely what that looks on. I'm not convinced the geographic argument ultimately kills the possibility of still being able to do it. I do think we just need to do everything we can to start to reverse and stop these trends. If that makes sense. Yeah, I think we have the next over here. Yes.
Well, all that you talk about governmentally is incredible and important. But what about the people? What about the Israeli citizens? I'm talking about progressive people who don't trust the Palestinians, maybe who even worked for them and who turned against them in such a horrible way. And how is that going to happen?
Sure. So the question was, what about the Israeli people and the lack of trust that exists towards Palestinians, especially after October 7th, but even going back before then, I think for a long time. The lack of trust, I think, that exists mutually on both sides too. That is a really hard question, and it always is when it comes to these conflicts. I think I look at it in a couple different ways. One is there's a pretty solid history where a lot of times leadership needs to come first and people follow. So, my parents were in Israel, and they always talk about Sadat's visit, right? It was Sadat's visit, which came, a few months before Camp David, was so key because it fundamentally convinced people, they do want to make peace. Up until that point, and even if you look at polling now, right? If you look at polling of Israelis and you look at polling of Palestinians and you say, here's the two-state solution and here's what it looks like, do you support it? You get numbers that are sometimes like in the 40% or so, right? Now, for both sides. Now, if you say to the Israelis, here is the solution, and Palestinians have already agreed to this, would you agree to it? The number jumps to 60%. And similarly, if you say to Palestinians, the Israelis have already agreed to it, would you agree to it? The number jumps to 60%. In other words, there's a significant chunk that wants to make peace and is ready. There's another significant chunk that just is not going to be ready for a long time. But then there's this third significant chunk that can be convinced, and if leaders take steps together, and this is also something that was true in the 90s, talking to, my old boss, Martin Indyk, who was our ambassador, to Israel in the 90s and very involved throughout the Clinton administration, told me one of the things that was just a difference and then he also worked on these negotiations with John Kerry in 2014 that I was part of. And one of the things Martin said is the differences in the 90s, Arafat and Rabin used to work together. Arafat would do things to signal Rabin's population and the Israelis, and Rabin would do things publicly to make it easier for Arafat. Or sometimes Rabin would come to Arafat and say, I need to do this for my own politics and you're not going to like it, but this is why I'm doing it. And Arafat would say, okay. And similarly, if you actually have the moderates and the ones who want peace playing off each other and strengthening each other's hands, like that works in the same way that, frankly, groups like Hamas and Netanyahu play off each other. It was Hamas's actions. Rabin was assassinated by Israeli extremists. Hamas launched a bunch of bombings at Israelis. That's what got Netanyahu elected, right? You see how the extremists on both sides play together too. So you need to get into a more virtuous cycle, and then you can convince the public with it. So.
Very close to out of time.
Do we want to do if somebody gives me a pen, we can do lightning round of just, yeah, we can go through as many questions as possible. I'll write them down and then I'll just try to do one as many quick answers as I can.
Anyone have a pen?
I got a pen, I'm good.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll go around and get some questions.
I bring one for speaking events exactly for this.
Should I ask it out loud? I was sitting here a month or two ago when our own Leo Baeck, Leonard Bierman Foundation had a presentation of a Palestinian young woman and an Israeli speak about this a land for all, I think is, and I'm wondering what your perspective is on that and the hopefulness of that movement and how big or small is it?
Okay, we have one over here too.
Who is the Palestinian leader that will lead the Palestinians to peace?
Okay, who else has one? Oh, there you go.
I listen to United Jews for Democracy, and occasionally they have speakers from Israel. And over the since October 7th, people have been saying with Netanyahu and the hostages needs to leave. Do you think there's any chance for anything to happen when he's still the leader?
Hi, Ilan. I know you're still jotting notes, but I'll jot away. My name's Jake Levine. You and I were actually colleagues when you were working for the VP and I was working at the NSC. One of the programs pre-October 7th that seemed very promising was the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which required an investment of about $50 million a year into the Palestinian private sector. I'm wondering how you see the economic opportunities here and where the multilateral institutions like the Bank and the European Reconstruction Development Bank, some of the other DFIs are in the rebuild context.
And one more over here. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
two more.
I'd like to know why not use Iron Dome and other so-called defensive weapons as a tool to pressure Israel to make peace. After all, it's those defensive weapons that enable Israel to use offensive weapons.
Sure.
How do you rebuild Gaza?
How do you rebuild Gaza?
Rebuild Gaza. Okay. Big one. All right. So I will fire away. Some of these are more meta than others, like that last one. Right, starting with Land for All, and basically these various movements that bring Palestinians and Israelis together, I think it's a vital piece of the equation, one that maybe, look, I come from a bias of, I've spent my career in government, so I'm always thinking about the negotiations and the room and the leadership, which is like one piece of this, and I believe at the end of the day, that's going to be the piece that has to come first, but that piece only comes if you've got ties getting stronger amongst the populations. And so anything you can do when it's easy, when it's hard, and in moments when it's hard, those things are particularly important. But then in moments of opportunity, those things can really pick up legs and go a lot further. And so I think that the people-to-people work that happens between Israelis and Palestinians is vital no matter what. And we always, when we're at J Street, whenever we take delegations to Israel and Palestine, we always have folks meet with representatives from some of these different groups, both when they're in Israel and also in Ramallah, precisely because it's just so important for people to see that this is possible. On leader, who could lead the Palestinians, I don't know an individual. I mean, people fixate on Barghouti in particular, but the reality is, look, Palestinian society is quite dynamic. You go into Ramallah and you've got a lot of people, maybe like my age or a little bit older, a little bit younger, super successful, private sector, government, very dynamic, super smart, really interesting to talk to. You do those meetings and you feel pretty hopeful, and then you roll into the official government meeting to meet with like a number of guys over 80 years old who are all smoking cigarettes, right? And so, and oh, by the way, like the dynamic crowd, there's men, there's women, it's diverse. You walk into the government building and it's all men, right? And so there is a generation there ready to take the reins. I think the current generation really needs to give it up. And this is part of Palestinian reform that we've talked about, and that reform has to come internally from Palestinians, but it also has to come with an Israeli partner who, going back to that point I made earlier about an Israeli strategy to empower moderates instead of trying to undercut them at every turn. So, because at the end of the day, in this power dynamic, Israel still holds all the cards, or Israel holds 9 out of every 10 cards, right? Palestinians still have responsibility. I think saying, oh, the Palestinian Authority is great, you can just deal with it as it is, that's not accurate. It's also not accurate to say, oh, if they were just to reform themselves and Israel were to do nothing different in its behavior. Like, look, most recently, we have a new Palestinian prime minister who's actually not great on all things, but a significant improvement over the previous one, a very effective technocrat. For the last year and a half, he's had to manage with a fourth of the expected budget because the Israeli government is holding the rest of his budget in tax revenues that are actually collected. They're collected by Israel, it's part because that was the deal during the Oslo cards, on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. It's Palestinian Authority money. This Israeli government with Smotrich as finance minister is holding all that money. And so how successful can you be as a reforming Palestinian politician when suddenly you have a quarter of the size of the budget you expected, So there's a dynamic there, but I can testify to there being a lot of very capable next generation Palestinians coming if we're in a position to empower them and help them. Next question was, Netanyahu, how much progress can you... Look, I think Trump actually has a remarkable amount of leverage over Netanyahu because Netanyahu has spent years cultivating Trump and building an alliance with Trump and making Trump the most popular American politician in Israel with Netanyahu's own base. And when Trump decides he wants Netanyahu to do something, he's actually seems to have a lot of leverage in making it happen. I mean, I got to say, as a former Biden administration official, it's pretty frustrating when every chance he had with us, he would publicly accentuate every difference, while with Trump, he goes out of his way to not have that confrontation. But in the current moment, okay, fine. If Trump wants to use it for good, I'm happy with that, even if some of his motives are questionable. But we're only going to make so much progress. You can end the war that way. You can get the hostages out. You can stop the fighting. We're not going to make real movement towards a peace between Israelis and Palestinians with Bibi Netanyahu at the helm. So we have elections next year. The polling is kind of all over the place. For a long time, it's been very strong for the opposition. Those numbers have narrowed in the aftermath of the deal to end the war, because that was very popular actually in Israel. But I still think there's a very good chance you end up with an alternative government. On the issue of the DFIs and kind of rebuilding of Gaza, it's unclear to me. First thing I think that has to happen is we need to, and actually this also, maybe I'll also combine this with this question of how you rebuild Gaza. There's a reason I spoke so much about security and governance, because you got to get especially security in place first, or nobody's going to invest anything. But then once you do, I think there's a huge opportunity. I agree that the MAPI program was a really positive development. It's been, that's been gutted by the Trump administration as part of their initial early sweep of taking out USAID and so many other aid programs around the country. So much of what was being used to support Palestinians and Israelis, any peace-building programs is gone. But if they're now making it a big priority and in the aftermath of the war, is there an opportunity to put a lot more money towards this? Maybe. And I will say also from the European, the EBRD, the EU has actually gotten much more invested in supporting the Palestinian Authority again, have given it €1 billion, precisely because the Israelis are taking all their, holding all their money in the last year, once with this new reform government, and are lining it up to specific reform benchmarks that the Palestinian government needs to make. That's a positive development. People talk about 10 or 15 years ago when you had Salam Fayyad running the Palestinian Authority and it was better run and much more effective. One of the reasons Salam Fayyad was successful is because you have a world engaged and billions of dollars going in. It's a lot easier to reform and build when you have international money coming in. And that's really dried up over the last 15 years as the issue has become less of a focus. And maybe one of the silver linings of the absolute horrible last couple of years is the world is engaged again. And so maybe that means a lot more funding and support, which means opportunity to actually build new things. And that also goes, again, towards that question of rebuilding Gaza. Iron Dome, I understand that that's definitely an argument that's out there by some. I think at the end of the day, though, what Iron Dome has also done a lot of is those are rockets and missiles being fired at Israeli civilians, right? And so I understand why they're being fired at Israeli civilians, partially because Hamas doesn't have the technical capability to pinpoint target, military targets on the Israeli side. But still, I'm for the U.S. providing weapons that stop attacks on Israeli civilians or Palestinian civilians. And the other thing it actually has done, at least before the war in Gaza, is it actually prevented a lot of because Hamas, Hezbollah, others have been launching missiles at Israel for years. And Israel's ability to knock a lot of those things down politically before October 7th actually meant it could be much more restrained in its response. That in the aftermath of October 7th, I don't think that equation still holds in the same way. So I think that argument isn't nearly as strong as it used to be. But fundamentally, those are missiles going at civilians. And so I'm for the U.S. continuing to allow Israel to defend the civilian population. And so that's why I put that
Ilan,
down. So.
You have given us power-packed hour and a half. You've got to be tired and drenched and thirsty and all that.
Before we close, we have one more speaker closing for us, if that's okay.
Oh,
It'll be
I'm
very
sure.
quick. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Hi, everybody.
Be on the way out, folks.
My name is Daniel Rozoff. Thank you so much, Ilan, for that amazing talk. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have the pleasure of being the LA co-chair of advocacy along with Peter over there, and I also am Rabbi John Rozoff's son, which is great. And a big thank you also to Leo Baeck and to Laura Massler. Thank you very, very much for making this connection happen. Thank you, thank you. And Could the folks on the Executive Committee for Los Angeles just raise your hands really quickly? So these folks are here to talk more about getting involved with J Street locally, whether you are interested in advocacy in our political operation, learning more about the conflict, joining amazing briefing calls. We encourage all of you to get involved, and most importantly, we encourage you guys to come to the national conference, which is taking place February 28 to March 3. And this is really where we show our power in Washington. One of the only ways we're going to be able to move the needle is through people power, and those lobby days are incredibly important to back up the advocates in J Street that are on the Hill every single day. So thank you again for being here, and please sign up and talk to the J Street staff who are in the back, and thank you very much again, Ilan, for a great talk.
Judy, please go ahead, sorry. Thank you again for coming and for being here. We too have programs the second Wednesday of each month in the morning. Pat Morrison will be interviewing in December 10th, Israeli hostage from Ben Gurion University. And we have in November, Speak Up for Justice, Paul Kiesel will be here. If you're interested, please sign your name up on this email list. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much to the community engagement.
May I ask you a question? Hi, great hearing you. I understand there's a lot of sensibilities around everything. Having to thread needles and things. But less so in a political way, but more infrastructurally. Are there dampening factors into the agreement that we have today that will make the ceasefire less fragile? Are there, like, what can be done to support this process other than us saying, oh, yeah, that's great?
Really fantastic.
Thank you very much. Like just in terms of structurally what the administration is doing?
Yeah, I mean, you're in policies, so I know a lot of thought goes into setting this up for some kind of success, understanding that this isn't a perfect world.
Yeah, I think the big part is right now all these visits are partially meant to, in fact, Vance is there, Rubio's there, Freed, Son, and trying to get everybody together. I think doing everything that they're doing right now in terms of bringing the Egyptians into Gaza, right across, trying to get all of the...
Is there a Sadat visit that can happen that is, I don't know, the Crown Prince or the Sisi or, or
not quite yet.
Jolani or I don't know.
I think they're going to need to see more progress, but yes, I think there comes a moment where like a MBS visit will be incredibly powerful.